It's been a couple months since I last uploaded a video. Definitely apologize for that. Holidays got in the way, work got in the way, all that fun stuff. You guys know how it is. Today's video, we're going to work through the remaining effort on the item filtering as well as our item tooltips. So we'll walk through, show you how we build all that, and then by the end, we should have a conclusion to the series. Now, let's talk about how we're going to actually filter these items. I don't envision it being that difficult, but sometimes it's nice to take a step back and sort of diagram out how you're planning on attacking a specific problem. Let's go ahead now and define what our items look like. Now, if you remember, we take a game entity and we attach a component to it or multiple components to define what that item really is. So in our case, there's really three different types of items that exist in our inventory. We've got a weapon, a consumable, and an armor piece. And each of these components attached to a game entity will allow us to then filter based off of that component. So here's what I'm thinking. What if we capture each of these different components and we create an item filter that then knows about that specific component? And then the item filter can have some logic that will check for the existence of a component on a particular item. So maybe it has like a dot equals function where you check and see if a filter or if an item has the component that that filter is checking for. That'll allow us to kind of quickly scale that out for any different type of component that we might run into. And back in our solution here, I've taken that concept and gone ahead and done a first pass of what that functionality could look like. The first thing that you might notice is that in our constructor, we take in a component to filter by. By passing in a component, that's going to allow this item filter to do the different operations that we needed to do, which essentially is just comparing a component to whatever this item filter is responsible for. So that's what this equals function is doing. It takes in the component to compare and just does a quick equality check on if it matches what you originally specify in the constructor. So a quick recap of what the component constructor is. In our XE framework, we define these things called tag components. Tag components really are just what it says. It's a way to tag an item and say this item is of a certain type. Under the hood, XE is able to optimize tag components because it assumes there's not going to be any data elements involved. Now, in an actual game, you might have some other properties on your armor component that you might want to use a regular component for. In our case, we're not that far along yet, so we're just going to use the tag component, which makes things a little bit easier. So outside of the equals function, there's really only two other things that our item filter needs to do. So first thing is the apply functionality. We want to apply the item filter to the items, to the inventory grid. So we pass in an array of slots. We loop through each of those slots. If the slot has an item, we grab the item instance from the slot, and then we check to see if it has the component that we're checking for. If it is a weapon component, for example, then we go and hide that item if it doesn't match the component. Likewise, on the clear side of things, this is going to be called really anytime that you click one of the other buttons. So if you're currently filtering by your weapon components, and then you click on the consumable, for example, we need to clear the existing filter first before we can apply the new one. So we needed to add a way to do that easily, and that's all this clear function is doing. So that's great and all, but none of this is actually wired in yet. If you're following along, we need to create another class here. So let's create the InventoryGridFilterManager. Again, I've already created this class to save some time, so you'll need to go ahead and create this on your own machine. Let's talk about what this is doing. The first thing you're going to notice is that it's going to take in some parameters here. So weapon filter, consumable filter, shield filter, and player inventory. Admittedly, these probably aren't the best names for these variables. This really should be, and we can do this a quick rename, weapon filter button, because this is the button that we just created in the InventoryFilterGridFactory. So it's going to be the actual phaser game object. So let's rename this as well, just to be clear. That way, when you come back to this in a later time, you'll remember what these properties are actually used for. Naming is important. Player inventory, although it's somewhat accurate, is not really what the object is. This is the InventoryGridManager. I'm going to leave that one for now. Now, if you're just eyeballing some of this code, there's definitely some duplicate logic here. So each of these sort of subscriptions on the phaser pointer up event are going to do pretty much the same thing, with the exception of they're checking against a different component type. So in our case, we really have three. So there's a weapon filter, the consumable filter, and the shield filter. And let's make this a little bit cleaner. Let's do one more rename here. This is the armor filter button. There we go. That way I don't confuse myself. Now let's use the weapon filter button to talk through what exactly this filter logic is doing. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to check to see if there's already a filter being applied. Because if there is, then we want to clear that functionality. We want to revert back to having all of our items present within the inventory window. Maybe in the future, we'll support the ability to have multiple filters going at once, but that's not really in the cards for this video. If there is a filter already applied, then we want to go and clear the filter from all of the inventory slots. So let's bring back all of the items to the forefront of the window. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to check to see if the current filter is the weapon filter. The reason we want to do this is because if this is true, what this means is you've clicked the weapon filter button again in the UI. So you clicked it once, it filtered all the items, and now you're clicking again because you want to undo that action, bringing all the items back. So again, if that's true, then we set the current filter to undefined, and then we return out of this function. So that lands us back at the original state of the inventory window, where we have all of our items and all of that fun goodness present in the window. If there is no filter, so if you click it again, for example, then we want to go and create a new item filter. So this is our item filter class that we just discussed, and we're going to pass in a reference to the component constructor, and in this case, that's going to be the weapon component. And then we just go ahead and we apply the filter to the inventory grid slots. So we pass in the slots from the player inventory, which is our inventory grid manager. And if you remember, each of those slots has some utility methods on them for getting the item and doing a bunch of different things. So the filter has pretty much everything it needs to apply the logic there. And each one of these is really doing the same thing. So there's probably some cleanup that could be done to sort of generalize this function. But I didn't take the liberty of doing some refactoring on that. So you're more than welcome to do that if you'd like. But for now, this works pretty well for what we want to do. I did add an event emitter here. In a future use case, you might want to bubble up events to your UI when certain filters are being applied. And in this case, you would have some sort of event emitter on this class. And then, if you apply a filter, maybe you emit an event that's like item filter, like let's say you wanted to, play some audio effect. Well, you could bubble that up and have an audio manager that's listening to these sort of events. And that allows you to kind of scale out things without worrying about, coupling a bunch of the different managers together. So that's great. We've created the item filter class. We've created the manager that'll handle all of the different interactions with those buttons. But now we need a way to create the buttons themselves. So let's jump over into the InventoryGridFilterFactory. And we're sort of following along with the pattern that we followed in the previous videos, where we create a factory function for instantiating and adding all of the different UI elements to the phaser game scene. So really it's just a wrapper, a utility function to kind of pass through the phaser scene. And then we use that to invoke the Rex UI plugin and build out our UI in that way. So if you're just following along, you're not going to have any of these filter elements here yet. That's what we're going to add now. I'm pulled this up side by side just so I can explain what each of these lines of code is actually doing for us. So the first thing you're going to see is this filter sizer, which really is just a container around the whole filter grid here. And it really is just a grid, and we specify the number of columns and the number of rows. So it's a 1x4. And then the space, you can sort of say, hey, I want my columns to be spread out by 5 pixels. And the Rex UI plugin will go ahead and just handle spacing those out evenly, depending on the number of elements that you have. And so we're going to go through and we're going to define each of the buttons that we want to use for our filter functionality. So we've got the weapon filter, consumable filter, and the armor filter, which obviously lines up to each one of these. And I created this button factory to sort of abstract some of the creation logic away because it's common for each of the different buttons. So let's take a quick look at that. So our interactive button factory creates just a standard button, and the button is an overlap sizer, which in the Rex UI world is just a way to overlay multiple game objects on top of each other. For the background of our button, we're using a 9 slice. This was something Phaser just added recently, which is really nice. But it's a way for you to, supply a background for a button, and no matter the size of that button, it'll maintain proportions, and you don't have that weird thing where it's going to stretch out your background based off of the size of the button. So there's some pretty good documentation around that. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but that's what we're using for these buttons here. So we create the background, we add the background of the button, and then we conditionally check our props that we pass in. So if you pass in an icon, we're going to add the icon to the button. If you pass in text, we're going to add the text to the button. If you pass in icon and text, I actually don't have a check for that. So I'm assuming that would probably look pretty weird. I don't think it would line up correctly. But again, that's something that you can try on your own. Really, the last thing to call out here in this button factory is at the end, we're hooking into the interactive functionality in Phaser. So we tell Phaser, hey, we want to use the hand icon to, which actually doesn't seem like it's working. Let's do a little refresh maybe. Some reason that's not working. It's supposed to use the hand cursor to kind of indicate to the user that you can actually click on it. I'll have to look into that later. And then we just want to hook into pointer over and pointer out. And for this particular button, there's really just two things we want to do. And it really just adds that border around the icon so that we can make it feel more interactive as you're moving your cursor. That's about all this class is doing. Again, pretty basic, just to create these filter buttons for us. So we create those 4 different buttons, including auto sort. And then at the end, we just want to add these buttons to our filter sizer, which again is just our grid that displays these in a nice formatted way. So if we go back down to the bottom of this class, the last thing we need to do is instantiate the manager that we just created a few minutes ago. So we pass in all the different buttons that we need. And then the last thing that the InventoryGridFilterManager needs is the InventoryGridManager, which again is the manager responsible for handling all the different functionality for the inventory slots. So we make use of some of the API that we've already built out in that regard. You might notice we're not passing in the auto sort button. I haven't actually built that functionality yet. I think that would be a fun sort of exercise for you guys, right? Is to see if you can extend this and add the auto sort functionality. I don't think it'd be too terribly difficult, but it'd be a fun exercise nonetheless. And the last thing, following along with our factory classes, we need to return the thing that we created. So let's do that. Let's return the filter sizer here. And that's about all this class is doing. So you all should be close to having something rendered on the screen for the filter grid. We've created the item filter. We've created the manager that handles the interactions with the item filters. We've created the factory that creates the UI elements, that ultimately invokes the item filters. The last thing we need to do is actually create the filter grid itself and insert that into our inventory window. And so to do that, let's hop back over here to the inventory window factory. This is sort of like the root of where everything starts. So we're going to need to invoke the factory creation method for the InventoryGridFilterFactory. So we do that, we pass in the scene, and we pass in the InventoryGridManager. So that gives us back an instance of the inventory filter grid. Now we want to go to our inventory window and actually add this new grid, which is just a game object, a Rex UI object, which inherits from the Phaser game objects. So let's add that into the parent container that we call inventory window. And I've adjusted the padding and spacing a little bit. So you'll need to, if you've done the previous videos, you'll need to adjust these a little bit to get them to line up. And that should be all we need to do. And after you do that, you should be able to launch the app and see that you actually have that filter grid running. But the other half of this video is getting the item tooltip information working. So let's jump into that now. As a quick reminder of what we want to build, for each of our items, we want to show some information about that item. And for us, that's a matter of sort of taking the components that are attached to these items and just decomposing them into their parts. So really all we have right now is a value and a description and a name. You might want to show the image. You might want to show, like, if your item has item modifiers, maybe if your item's like a quest item, you'd want to put some tag on it. So there's lots of stuff you can do, but I can show you how I handle some of this functionality today. So we're going to start this off with another new class here. So we're going to create the InventoryItemTooltipManager. which implements a interface that we've created in a previous video. All it has is one function called show item tooltip. Now, the reason you might want to use an interface for this is you might want to display your item information differently based off the context, right? Based off of where that item is. So for your inventory, maybe you want to show the tooltip information, but if it was like your equipment window or maybe some other place, you might want to show some other information about that item. So by using this interface, you can make sure that no matter where this item is displayed, you know that you're going to have the appropriate method to call when the time comes. So let's take a look at what we're passing in the constructor here. All it's taking in is the phaser scene and the item slot that will be displaying the actual item tooltip. So let's talk about what this show item tooltip is actually doing. The first thing that we do is we check to see, hey, is there already an instance of the item tooltip present on the scene? So we created this scene variable to sort of store that reference for us. So if we hop over there, all it is on our phaser scene, and we call our scene the main scene. We just create a new property called item tooltip, and we set a reference or define the type as sizer, which is a Rex UI game object. Now, it's worth pointing out that the design decision I made was that each individual item slot got an item tooltip manager. That might not be the best approach. You might want to have one item tooltip manager that you use as sort of like a global sort of modal, where as the cursor goes over an item slot, you sort of just inject the information about the item into a single instance. But I didn't go that decision. I didn't go that route. I took a different route. So we actually have one of these per item slot, which is why you see that we pass in the item slot. So the first thing that we do, the second thing that we do is we check to see, hey, do we actually have an item? If there is an item, we grab the entity property off of that item. And really, you should have some sort of null check here. You should make sure that there is an item before trying to show the tooltip. So let's make sure we add a comment here. Check to make sure if item exists. Now, I do think we have that check in the get item. So if we check into ItemManager.getItem, which I believe looks like we actually don't have that check. So I'm not sure if that would blow up or not, but you should definitely null check and make sure that your item tooltip is not trying to show for an item that doesn't exist. That wouldn't be good. So let's add a comment there. We might need to add that down the line. So the next step really is to create the item tooltip from that item entity. And the item entity is the thing that has all of the components that we've defined for these items via the JSON objects from the previous videos. So we'll take a look at the ItemTooltipFactory in a second, but let's just kind of keep going down this path and see kind of what the remaining logic here is doing. So the first thing we're going to do after we create the item tooltip is we need to position that item based off of where the item slot is in the UI, because we want the tooltip to show relative to the item. We don't want it to show like in the middle of the screen, although there might be a use case for that in your game. So you'd have to adjust some of this if that were the case. So we're doing just some quick math here to sort of position an offset based off the height and the Y positioning of the slot sprite. So we get this Y position. And then the last thing we need to do is just adjust the position of the item tooltip using the set X and set Y API of the phaser game object. Now, you'll see this set depth on here, which I added as a way to just ensure that the item tooltip always sits on top of the items. You don't want your item tooltip to be displaying in your inventory and then have all the items underneath it kind of sit on top of it. It looks kind of silly. Obviously, that wouldn't be what you wanted, and it would block the text. You wouldn't be able to read it. So this 205 really is an arbitrary number. I definitely don't suggest that you go and try to manage these yourselves. It should kind of naturally work if you arrange your game objects in the correct way. But there are some cases where you might just say, hey, I always want this item to appear on top. And if you're going to do that, I would suggest creating a constant variable somewhere where you're very clear that this is a magic number, and so you don't get confused down the line. And so this is really the only logic for actually creating the item tooltip. But let's jump into what actually creates the UI element and see what that's doing. All right, so we created a new class for this and we called it ItemTooltipFactory. So we create a container, which is the outer shell that holds the information about that item. So we create a new Rex UI sizer. The next thing we do is we create sort of an inner sizer, which is just a basic sizer as well, that we're calling ItemTooltipPanel. And this is where we're actually adding the background to. So for the background, I'm only creating a simple round rectangle. You might have a nice kind of pixel art background that you've created, and you could add a background in this way too. To keep it simple though, I'm only adding a round rectangle for this case. Now at the very top of our item tooltip, we're showing the item name. So we're kind of chaining some of these adds together because the Rex UI plugin uses a builder pattern. So it returns an instance of itself, which makes it nice for sort of just chaining the different creation methods together. So I created a function for creating the title header. Let's take a quick look at that. So give it a scene, you give it the item. It creates a container for the item label, creates some text, and then it just adds the text to the label and then returns the container back to the parent function. Now, again, I'm using some hard-coded values here for font size and color. Would definitely suggest if your project, if you plan on your project getting any sort of size or scale, you should definitely have sort of some config or some constants file where it makes it a lot easier to change all of the different text in your game all at once. Of course, I'm taking some shortcuts here for the video, but I don't suggest hard-coding things like font size and color if you don't have to. So we've got our header, that's great, but we want to add some more information about this item too. The description and maybe the value of the item. And those are really the only things that we have on our items right now. So we chain another .add here and we're creating another sub container within the parent container. And in that is where we create the two different light items that you've seen from just a couple of minutes ago. So we create a value kind of text where we go and check and get the value of the item. So that has a little bit of logic in it because we check to see if the item has a quantity component, because if it does, then we know it's a stack of items, and to get the final value of that stack, all we have to do is multiply the value by the quantity. So that'll give us the final value. If it's not a stack, right? If it doesn't have a quantity component, we can just return the flat value of the item. So that makes it pretty easy to just get that value for us. And then the last thing we do is we just add one more label, one more text for the description of the item, which again, I've hard-coded all the font sizes, so keep that in mind. Now it'd be super easy, right, if we did have more components we wanted to display information about, to just keep chaining these different add methods together. And then the Rex UI plugin will handle making sure that those stay proportionally, centered, or however you've adjusted your padding. It'll make sure that everything scales nicely. So final step here, let's make sure we add the item tooltip panel to the outer container. We call .layout, which does all of the math to align things. And then that returns back an instance of the sizer game object. So when we look back to where that's being invoked, that's how we're getting our item tooltip. So that's what's actually being assigned to this scene. So that's what we try to destroy, right? So as you're moving your mouse over the different items, as a item tooltip comes up, when you go over another item, the previous one will get removed. So that's sort of how it works. It's probably not super performant, but I haven't seen really any performance issues with it. If I were to do this again, I'd probably try and refactor this in a bit where maybe not every single item slot has its own manager for the tooltip. I'd probably try to keep that at like the global level and just inject the tooltip information, but maybe that's a potential refactor opportunity in the future. So we've got the UI for the tooltip created, and we've got the manager for showing the tooltip created, but we don't have any way right now to hook into the pointer events to actually show this item tooltip. So let's get started on that. And there's really not too much that needs to be done. So let's jump over into our inventory grid slot factory, because if you remember, I mentioned that we're creating one of these item tooltip managers for each of the inventory grid slots. So if you haven't already, we need to create a new instance of the inventory item tooltip manager. So new up one of these, and we're going to pass this into our slot.registerManagers function, which just assigns a private variable to each of the different managers that sort of compose this inventory grid slot. Now we're going to expose the ItemTooltipManager show item tooltip functionality by adding an additional function to the inventory grid slot. So let's add this show item info, which will just invoke the underlying ItemTooltipManager show item tooltip. Now you can imagine that this will most likely be called by a pointer event handler, which we have already created. So we just need to then evoke the show item input or show item info for the item slot that's currently being moused over. So inside of our inventory pointer event manager, that's where we're going to make this happen. So in our pointer over function, this is when the mouse goes over the item slot. And I see now we actually are checking that the item slot has an item before invoking this. So we don't need that null check that I kind of mentioned a couple of minutes ago. Although it's not necessarily a bad thing to be defensive with your programming in the different layers, we did account for it. So nothing should currently be blowing up. So that's good. But all this does is it invokes the show item info on the item slot whenever their mouse is currently over the item slot. So that's awesome. That will show the item. And funny enough, as I started explaining this handle pointer out, I realized we had a small issue. It's really important that you remove a reference to a game object before trying to destroy it. And generally, it's not a super great idea to try and store references to game objects because then you have to remember to do this. Otherwise, the garbage collector won't run and clean up those resources after you destroy them. So if you want to compare like the previous clip to where we're at now, you can see what I changed. But the biggest thing is that I make sure to set the reference to undefined before calling .destroy. But as the user is moving the pointer out, we want to destroy the tooltip if it exists. So we do check and make sure that it exists. Now, if you remember within our tooltip manager, we actually tried to do the same thing here, and we don't actually need that functionality. So let's go back over into our tooltip manager and destroy this line, remove this line, and save, because we're handling it sort of at a higher level. And so the ItemTooltipManager itself doesn't need to worry about removing the instance of the tooltip. So now that we got the tooltips and item filtering in place, let's check it out and see everything in action here. So I'm going to switch windows. So first thing, let's check the item filtering. So this should filter based off of the weapon. So it looks like that's working. You can click again and it will undo the filter. Same thing with consumables. So we have 2 potions in here. So we filter on the potions and then 1 single piece of armor, which we filter using the armor button here. The auto sort we didn't build. Again, that could be a fun way to extend this project a little bit if you guys want to take on adding that functionality in. I don't think it'd be too bad. And let's check the item tooltip. So the gold shows a value of 1. That's correct based off of the quantity. So the dagger, value of 6. If you check the JSON objects in the repository, you should be able to see these values line up with what you see now. And we've got a nice little description in there. And you can make this look a lot nicer if you had a nice background, if you did your own pixel art and that kind of thing. But we're just going with the bare bones style for now. So with that, the series comes to a conclusion. Hopefully you got something out of it. I've got some stuff planned for future videos, maybe do some multiplayer stuff. We'll see. But if this video helped you at all, throw a like on there. I'd appreciate it, and see you next time.